generations, my people have been warmed by the sun, rising over the lake we call Gichigami. Gichigami has provided for my people. For us, the big lake has a spirit. Its waters are generous and alive. They can also be dangerous and unforgiving. Along these waters and along our lakes and rivers is a great story, one that's unknown to most. This is a story about when my people, the Ojibwe, were the most powerful tribe of the Great Lakes. During the 1700s, this land was the center of a great trade. A global trade. In those days, the Europeans needed us more than we needed them. They needed our skills as hunters. Just as important, they needed our knowledge of this vast country.
Attention vous tous, les racines, oh!
Today, we know them as voyageurs, a French word for traveler. It was said the fur trade was built upon their backs. I cannot disagree.
Nous sommes près de la Grande Portage, c'est juste là!
The voyageurs were human beasts of burden, and they could do the work far better and far cheaper than animals.
Courage, bon courage, mes amis!
Each voyageur was hired to transport trade goods along with pelts, trapped from the fur country of the Northwest. The Europeans had established over 100 trading posts that stretched all the way to the Pacific.
Incroyable, je suis absolument fatigué. Je peux pas le souffrir.
The voyageurs portaged on a trail my people called Gichi Onigaming, the Great Carrying Place. The Europeans had their own name for the trail, the Grand Portage. At the peak of the fur trade, the Grand Portage was a crossroad connecting the fur country of the West to Gichigami, the Great Lakes, and beyond. 8.5 miles long, the trail followed a natural gap in the hills. The Grand Portage was the most direct link between Fort Charlotte on the Pigeon River and Lake Superior. It ended at a large fur company depot along the shores of Gichigami. Back then, the place we today call Grand Portage was one of the busiest spots west of the Appalachians. This was the inland headquarters of Britain's Northwest Company. Voyageurs bringing furs from the west converged with canoes arriving with trade goods from the east. Arriving was rum from the West Indies, blankets, textiles, and knives from England, even vermilion from China. It was a time when the world came to and through Grand Portage. The Northwest Company depot was like a small city. 16 buildings were surrounded by a palisade 11 feet high. In other parts of America, stockades were built to keep Indians out. At Grand Portage, the stockade was built to welcome us in. That's because we supplied the furs. The pelts of beaver, martens, and other animals became a commodity that brought our people many new things. During the fur trade, we learned to do business with the white man. In the fur trade, the Europeans in Ojibwe found common ground, born of opportunity and profit. None of this would have been possible if not for the animal we called the beaver. In Europe, during the 1700s, it had become all but extinct. Across the ocean, the beaver hat had become a symbol of fashion, wealth, and social status. So, for the Europeans, it was the beaver that put Grand Portage on the map. During the fur trade, the closest town to Grand Portage was Montreal, the headquarters for the fur trade companies. Montreal was 1,400 miles away, a journey taking up to 8 weeks by canoe. The furs were loaded onto tall ships. They sailed nearly 4,000 miles across the Atlantic to cities like London and Paris, where the furs were used to make hats and clothing. From these European capitals, the clothing and hats were bought, sold, and distributed to places as far as Russia. So what ended in Europe and beyond began in Grand Portage. It wasn't the English, but the French who first came into our lands. They hoped to find a passage from the Great Lakes to the Pacific Ocean. In 1731, an explorer named La Vérendrye came, hoping our rivers and lakes could eventually lead him to the Orient. A Cree Indian named Oshiga drew him a map that would change the way of the fur trade. Oshiga showed La Vérendrye the Grand Portage. The Europeans would soon find this to be the quickest route into the fur country. This is why the Grand Portage was so important to the fur trade. At its mouth, the Pigeon River was wide enough for many canoes. But just 2 miles upstream was a 120-foot obstacle today called High Falls. Beyond High Falls were even more obstacles. Portaging up and around the basalt cliffs was almost as dangerous as canoeing the rapids. The post at Grand Portage not only connected different worlds, it connected different cultures. My great-grandmother was an important person at Grand Portage. Her name was Odawa Weikwe. In our language, that means trading woman. At Grand Portage, my great-grandmother served as a guide and a translator. Now, these were skills that were especially important when conducting trade. Hers was a position of great influence. In many ways, women like Odawa Weikwe helped create a bond between the Europeans and our people. The Europeans called us Ojibwe or Chippewa, but we called ourselves Anishinaabe, the original people. Our elders say we've lived on this land we call Turtle Island for time beyond memory. The waters surrounding us were as important as the land. My grandmother and her relatives lived by the moon and in rhythm with the seasons. We fished year-round, but the short summer was one of our best times. The fish were brought into our villages where they were smoked and dried. Each autumn, many harvested manomen, wild rice. The manomen was preserved by parching it over a fire. The rice was then hauled by jigging atop it. We called winter bibun. Our friends from the Northwest Company would visit our winter villages. We were eager to trade for wool blankets, metal pots, knives, and other items that would help make the long winters more comfortable. Most importantly, bibun was a time of trapping beaver, martens, and other animals. To capture a beaver, we'd chisel a hole in the ice using metal tools obtained in trade. Our men would scare the beaver out of the dam and into a net under the water. Spring was a time of renewal for our people. During this season, we perfected the jiman, or canoe. The canoes enabled us to travel great distances in and around the Great Lakes. They were easy to maneuver and strong enough to carry heavy loads. But what made the jiman truly amazing was its light weight. The birch bark made them light enough to portage from lake to lake. The voyageurs took our technology and made it their own. Some of their canoes were as long as 38 feet in length and held up to 16 paddlers. The voyageurs' canoes could carry up to 4 tons of cargo. Simply put, the fur trade would not have been possible without our jiman. By the 1790s, England's Northwest Company would surpass its bitter rival, the Hudson's Bay Company. Grand Portage became the hub for over 100 of the company's fur trading posts, some of which were 1,000 miles away. During this time, the Ojibwe and Europeans lived in peace. We were economic partners. During the fur trade, the Northwest Company prospered, and so did we. But during the fur trade, not all was good at Grand Portage. Alcohol was a trade good that would trouble our people for generations. And then there was disease. In 1782 and 1783, a European disease called smallpox ravaged North America. We had no immunity. The Ojibwe at Grand Portage, Rainy Lake, and Leech Lake were devastated, especially our elders. When they died, so did many of our Ojibwe stories and traditions. In time, the epidemic passed, but things would never be the same for the Ojibwe. Still, the business of the fur trade forged on. Every summer at Grand Portage, the Northwest Company would celebrate their success with what the Europeans called the Rendezvous. The Rendezvous was weeks of business, pleasure, and occasional excesses. For one night a year in the Great Hall, matters of business were put aside. Our tribal headman, an important Ojibwe woman, were special guests at a grand ball. Odawa Weikwe and the other women wore fine dresses made of English wools and silk from Asia. They were adorned with beads from Venice and beautiful jewelry made in Montreal. Little did we know that politics and disputes between Britain and the new United States would be the beginning of a great change. The United States had defeated Great Britain in the American Revolution. But the Canadian border in the fur country west of Lake Superior was still to be determined. If the negotiated border was found to be north of Grand Portage, the British-owned Northwest Company would actually be located in the United States. The fate of Grand Portage was now in the hands of ambitious politicians and their surveyors. By the turn of the 19th century, the issue had been decided. The new international border was determined to be the Pigeon River, just 6 miles north of Grand Portage. By treaty, the British post was indeed located in the new United States. The Northwest Company had little choice but to move their operations north of the Pigeon River and into British-ruled Canada. Our headmen negotiated a deal for the new post. But our homeland was to be cut in 2 pieces by strangers. Even our waters were divided. To us, this wasn't English or American land. The Creator had made this land for our people. In 1802, the last of the Northwest Company canoes paddled away from Grand Portage. Their new post in what is today Thunder Bay, Ontario, would eventually be named Fort William. For my great-grandmother and other Ojibwe people, it was not the end of the fur trade. That would continue for 2 more generations. But looking back, the closing of the Grand Portage post was the beginning of the end. The partnership and prosperity we shared with the Europeans would never be the same. In 1821, the Northwest Company merged with Hudson's Bay Company. By the 1850s, the fur trade era was all but over. Fashions changed, and the demand for beaver pelts all but vanished. Some Ojibwe say the great tragedy of the fur trade was that it ended. Next came a period we today still call the Hungry Years. Settlers arrived and in the 1850s created a state they called Minnesota. The Ojibwe were forced to cede our lands and were put on reservations. Like so many other tribes, the Grand Portage people were now at the mercy of the United States government. They wanted to assimilate us, to be civilized white Americans just like them. There were many hardships, but we endured. And today, we remain. The voyageurs have long gone. So has the Northwest Company. But Gitchagami is still here. And so are the Grand Portage people. We have our own government and care for our own tribal lands. We are Anishinaabe. we are also Americans. Today, we carry on many of the old traditions. And we still fish the waters of Gitchigami.
I'm Joe Deschamps, and this is my dad, Butch Deschamps. He's been fishing out here for 50 years.
We are still connected to the land. And through this place, we are connected to our ancestors. As our ancestors were partners with the Northwest Company, today we are partners with the National Park Service. Grand Portage National Monument has been established to preserve and protect our place, our story. At Grand Portage is a story I am proud to be a part of. A story I will pass along to my children. Hopefully, they'll pass it forward to the generations to come. Gee, miigwech. Thank you.